The intersection of national security and individual liberty has long served as the crucible in which the American experiment is tested, yet few instances in recent memory have captured this tension as vividly as the legislative interrogation led by Representative Alyssa Slotkin. The chamber remained hushed as the Michigan lawmaker confronted Secretary of Homeland Security Noem, a confrontation that quickly transcended mere partisan bickering to touch upon the bedrock principles of constitutional governance. At the heart of this exchange was a fundamental disagreement over the reach of the executive branch and its duty to protect the most vulnerable within its jurisdiction. The dialogue underscored an increasingly visible rift in Washington regarding how the law should be applied to those whose legal status remains in the shadows. This inquiry was not merely about policy statistics or logistical hurdles, but rather a profound examination of the moral compass guiding the Department of Homeland Security. As the proceedings unfolded, the focus intensified on reports suggesting a systematic expansion of deportation targets that included American citizens and those residing in the country under legal protections. Slotkin highlighted harrowing accounts of students and children with complex medical necessities being caught in a dragnet that appeared to prioritize volume over judicial precision. This aggressive posture by the department has raised alarms among civil rights advocates who argue that the administrative machinery is moving faster than the safeguards intended to restrain it. The Secretary maintained that her department's primary mandate is the absolute enforcement of federal law to ensure the integrity of the nation's borders. However, the friction between rigid enforcement and the nuanced reality of human lives created a palpable sense of urgency within the hearing room. The debate took a significant turn toward the theoretical and the historical when the discussion shifted to the concept of habeas corpus. This ancient legal doctrine, designed to prevent the state from detaining individuals without a clear legal justification, became the focal point of a sharp rhetorical clash. Slotkin posited that the current administration's interpretation of executive authority effectively bypasses the constitutional requirements for due process, creating a legal vacuum for those detained. By framing the issue as a misinterpretation of foundational protections, she challenged the very legitimacy of the department's operational procedures. The Secretary, conversely, defended the executive's right to act decisively in the interest of public safety, suggesting that the exigencies of the modern era require a more flexible approach to traditional legal constraints. Beyond the immediate concerns of immigration and personal liberty, the inquiry delved into the fiscal priorities of the Department of Homeland Security, specifically regarding cyber defenses. Slotkin presented a critical assessment of recent budget cuts directed at state-level cybersecurity programs, arguing that these reductions leave the nation's infrastructure vulnerable to foreign interference. She contended that while the department focuses its resources and rhetoric on physical borders, the digital gateways to the country are being neglected and weakened. This shift in funding represents a strategic gamble that many experts believe could have catastrophic consequences for national security in an increasingly digitized world. The argument suggested that a true commitment to safety requires a holistic approach that balances physical enforcement with the technical fortitude needed to repel invisible threats. This confrontation ultimately serves as a stark reminder of the delicate balance required to maintain the rule of law in a polarized political landscape. The pursuit of government accountability remains a cornerstone of the democratic process, ensuring that no agency operates beyond the reach of public scrutiny or judicial oversight. When political optics are allowed to overshadow the commitment to due process, the very fabric of the legal system begins to fray at the edges. The hearing highlighted the necessity of a vigilant legislature capable of challenging the executive branch whenever it oversteps its established boundaries. It also underscored the ongoing struggle to define what it means to be a nation of laws in an era defined by rapid social and technological change. The inquiry moved into a more granular examination of how administrative directives translate into street-level enforcement, often with devastating consequences for the principle of judicial review. Representative Slotkin pressed the Secretary on the specific mechanisms that allow the Department of Homeland Security to bypass traditional evidentiary standards when targeting individuals for expedited removal. This process, which often operates in the shadows of the federal court system, represents a significant departure from the American tradition of an open and transparent judiciary. By granting low-level administrative officers the power to act as judge, jury, and executioner, the executive branch has effectively created a parallel legal system. This system functions without the robust protections that the Bill of Rights was designed to provide to all persons within the United States. The rhetoric of the hearing sharpened as the discussion turned to the specific targeting of students who had entered the country under valid visas but found themselves caught in a web of shifting regulatory interpretations. These individuals, who often represent the intellectual and economic future of their communities, became symbols of a broader breakdown in the predictability of federal law. When a government changes the rules of engagement without adequate notice or a period for public comment, it undermines the fair notice doctrine that is central to American jurisprudence. Slotkin argued that this unpredictability creates a climate of fear that stifles innovation and discourages the global exchange of ideas. The Secretary's defense of these actions centered on a strict, almost mechanical, application of policy that leaves no room for the exercise of administrative discretion or humanitarian consideration. This mechanical approach to law enforcement was further scrutinized through the lens of medical necessity, particularly concerning children who require specialized care available only within American borders. The removal of such individuals is not merely a logistical exercise in border management, but a profound moral statement about the value a nation places on human life. Slotkin's line of questioning aimed to expose the disconnect between the department's public-facing mission to protect the homeland and its internal operational choices that jeopardize the lives of the most defenseless. There is a growing concern among legal scholars that such actions signal a move toward administrative absolutism, where the goals of the state supersede any individual claim to dignity or survival. The hearing sought to establish whether these decisions were isolated incidents of bureaucratic failure or part of a deliberate, top-down strategy to maximize deportation statistics. The debate over habeas corpus then took on a more technical character as the participants argued over the jurisdictional boundaries of the federal courts in the face of executive power. Historically, the writ of habeas corpus has served as the ultimate check against executive overreach, ensuring that no person can be held by the state without a valid reason subject to independent review. However, the current administration's legal counsel has suggested that certain classes of non-citizens may not possess the same standing to challenge their detention in Article III courts. Slotkin countered this by reminding the committee that the Constitution's protections are often framed in terms of the government's power, what it cannot do, rather than just the specific identity of the person protected. This distinction is vital because if the government is allowed to ignore the law for one group, the precedent is set to eventually ignore it for others. The erosion of these protections often begins with the dehumanization of the subjects involved, a theme that Slotkin explored by highlighting the language used in internal department memos. When human beings are reduced to units or targets in a statistical game of political achievement, the ethical barriers to abuse are significantly lowered. The Secretary was asked to reconcile the aggressive language of these directives with the department's stated commitment to civil rights and civil liberties. The inquiry revealed a troubling culture within the agency where political loyalty and the fulfillment of quotas appeared to outweigh the commitment to constitutional fidelity. This shift in organizational culture is perhaps the most dangerous legacy of an administration that prioritizes political optics over the quiet, steady work of upholding the law. The investigation then pivoted to a massive, often overlooked area of concern: the systematic defunding of state-level cybersecurity initiatives in favor of traditional physical security assets. Slotkin argued that in an era where a single line of malicious code can disable a power grid, the focus on physical barriers is an outdated relic of 20th century thinking. By stripping state governments of the resources needed to protect their local infrastructure, the federal government is creating a series of soft targets for international cyber adversaries. The Secretary's rationale for these cuts often focused on fiscal responsibility, yet the lawmaker pointed out the irony of saving millions on digital defense while spending billions on performative enforcement actions. This budgetary tension reflects a broader strategic failure to recognize that modern national security is inherently decentralized and digital. The political theater of the hearing room did not obscure the very real stakes involved for the integrity of the American democratic system. When a cabinet secretary appears to evade direct questions about the legality of their agency's actions, it sends a signal of impunity to the thousands of agents operating under their command. Slotkin's insistence on clear, unambiguous answers was a demand for accountability that goes beyond the immediate political moment. She suggested that the department's current path is not only legally questionable but also strategically short-sighted, as it alienates the very communities whose cooperation is essential for true domestic security. The lack of transparency regarding the criteria used for deportation raids only serves to deepen the mistrust between the public and the institutions designed to serve them. Furthermore, the discussion touched upon the role of the Chevron deference and how the department has utilized it to expand its own authority at the expense of legislative oversight. By claiming that their specialized expertise entitles them to interpret ambiguous statutes in the broadest possible way, executive agencies have effectively neutered the ability of Congress to set policy. Slotkin's interrogation was a pushback against this trend, asserting that the power to make law remains firmly within the halls of the Capitol, not the offices of the DHS. The Secretary's reliance on administrative flexibility was framed by the Congresswoman as a convenient excuse for avoiding the rigorous debate and compromise that should precede major policy shifts. This part of the exchange highlighted the ongoing struggle to reclaim the legislative branch's role as the primary architect of the nation's legal framework. The human element remained at the forefront as the hearing moved toward its conclusion, with Slotkin reading letters from constituents who had been directly impacted by the department's aggressive tactics. These voices, ranging from business owners whose employees were detained to doctors whose patients were removed, provided a vivid mosaic of the collateral damage caused by an unchecked executive. The argument was made that a nation's strength is not found in the rigidity of its walls, but in the fairness of its laws and the consistency of their application. By prioritizing the appearance of strength over the reality of justice, the department risks losing the moral authority that has historically underpinned American global leadership. The inquiry was a necessary, if uncomfortable, reminder that in a democracy, the ends can never justify the means if those means violate the fundamental rights of the people. As the session drew to a close, the focus remained on the long-term implications of these policy choices for the future of the American legal system. The precedents being established today regarding the suspension of due process and the centralization of executive power will likely haunt future administrations of all political persuasions. Slotkin's final remarks emphasized that the protection of civil liberties is not a partisan issue but a foundational requirement for a stable and free society. The Secretary, for her part, remained steadfast in her commitment to the administration's agenda, illustrating the deep ideological divide that continues to paralyze much of the federal government. This confrontation, while specific to the Department of Homeland Security, was a microcosm of the larger battle for the soul of the American constitutional order. The tension between federal mandates and state sovereignty has emerged as one of the most volatile battlegrounds in the current political landscape, specifically concerning the implementation of Homeland Security directives. As Representative Slotkin emphasized, The unilateral nature of these federal actions often leaves state governors and local law enforcement agencies in an untenable position, caught between federal demands and their own constitutional obligations to their residents. This friction is not merely a bureaucratic disagreement but a full-scale constitutional crisis regarding the anti-commandeering doctrine, which prevents the federal government from forcing states to implement federal regulatory programs. The Secretary's insistence on a unified, top-down approach to immigration and security enforcement has directly challenged this principle, leading to a series of legal skirmishes in district courts across the nation. Many states have argued that the federal government's aggressive deportation tactics disrupt local public safety and divert scarce resources away from community policing efforts. The debate over state-level cybersecurity funding serves as a prime example of how federal disinvestment can create cascading failures across the nation's critical infrastructure. When the Department of Homeland Security chooses to prioritize physical border assets over the digital resilience of individual states, it effectively weakens the entire national security posture. Slotkin pointed out that many state governments operate on razor-thin margins and rely heavily on federal grants to maintain their cyber defenses against increasingly sophisticated foreign actors. By slashing these programs, the administration is forcing local authorities to make impossible choices between securing their water treatment plants or their electoral databases. This strategic withdrawal of federal support represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the interconnected nature of modern security, where a vulnerability in one state's network can provide a backdoor into the entire national grid. Furthermore, the hearing touched upon the concept of interstate comity and how federal enforcement actions have begun to interfere with the legal processes of individual states. There have been documented cases where federal agents conducted raids near state courthouses, effectively intimidating witnesses and victims of crimes from participating in the state's judicial system. Slotkin argued that such tactics undermine the rule of law at the local level, creating an environment where justice is secondary to immigration status. The Secretary's response suggested that federal authority takes precedence in all matters of national interest, a stance that critics argue is a dangerous step toward federal overreach. This philosophy of federal supremacy at any cost has led to a breakdown in cooperation between federal agencies and local municipalities, many of which have declared themselves sanctuaries as a form of political and legal resistance. The economic implications of these policies also receive significant scrutiny, as the removal of legal residents and students has a direct impact on state and local economies. Many states rely on the labor and innovation of the very populations currently being targeted, and the sudden loss of these individuals can destabilize local industries. Slotkin raised concerns that the department's focus on short-term political wins ignores the long-term economic damage being inflicted on communities that are already struggling. The debate highlighted a disconnect between the administration's America First rhetoric and the reality of an economy that is deeply integrated with global talent and labor. The Secretary, however, maintained that the integrity of the border is a prerequisite for any economic stability, regardless of the immediate costs to specific sectors. As the inquiry delved into the specifics of the cybersecurity budget, the lawmaker challenged the department's reliance on privatized security solutions over public sector investment. Slotkin argued that by pushing states toward private contractors while simultaneously cutting federal oversight, the government is creating a profit-driven security model that lacks public accountability. This privatization of national security functions can lead to a lack of standardization, making it difficult for federal authorities to coordinate a unified response to a nationwide cyber attack. The hearing explored the possibility that these budget cuts were not just fiscal measures but a deliberate attempt to shift responsibility away from the federal government. This trend towards security devolution leaves the most vulnerable states at the mercy of hackers who view them as the path of least resistance. The ideological divide over the role of the Department of Homeland Security reflects a broader national disagreement on the definition of a secure nation. For the Secretary and her allies, security is achieved through the rigid application of law, the fortification of borders, and the swift removal of those who violate immigration statutes. For Slotkin and her supporters, security is a multifaceted concept that must include the protection of civil liberties, the preservation of community trust, and the hardening of digital infrastructure. These two worldviews collided in the hearing room, illustrating why comprehensive immigration reform and a unified national cyber strategy remain so elusive. The lack of a common vocabulary for discussing security threats makes it nearly impossible for the two branches of government to find meaningful common ground. The role of the judiciary in mediating these disputes has become increasingly critical as the executive branch continues to test the limits of its authority. Slotkin's interrogation was, in many ways, an appeal to the courts to reassert their role as the final arbiters of constitutional meaning. She suggested that the department's current actions are based on an expansive and historically inaccurate reading of executive power that the founders never intended. If the courts fail to provide a check on these activities, the result could be a permanent shift in the balance of power, with the executive branch operating virtually unchecked in the realm of national security. The Secretary's confidence in her department's legal standing reflects a belief that the current judicial climate is favorable to the administration's interpretation of the law. The human consequences of this legal and political maneuvering were never far from the surface of the discussion, as Slotkin continued to cite reports of families being separated and lives being appended. The use of students and children as pawns in a larger political game was characterized by the Congresswoman as a betrayal of American values. The Secretary defended her agency's actions as necessary for the maintenance of a lawful society, arguing that any exceptions to enforcement would only encourage further violations. This uncompromising stance has become a hallmark of the administration's approach, creating a situation where there is little room for administrative nuance or humanitarian relief. The hearing served as a public forum for these conflicting visions of American justice to be aired and debated. The discussion also touched on the global perception of the United States as a nation committed to the rule of law and human rights. Slotkin warned that the current path being taken by the Department of Homeland Security is damaging the country's reputation on the world stage and making it harder to build international coalitions. When the United States is seen as ignoring due process at home, its ability to advocate for democratic reforms abroad is significantly diminished. The Secretary dismissed these concerns as secondary to the immediate task of securing the homeland, a position that reflects a more isolationist view of national security. This exchange highlighted the tension between domestic policy and foreign policy in an era where the two are increasingly inseparable. The final segments of this part of the hearing focused on the need for systemic reform within the Department of Homeland Security to ensure greater transparency and accountability. Slotkin called for the creation of independent oversight bodies that have the power to investigate allegations of abuse and mismanagement without interference from political appointees. She argued that the current internal review processes are insufficient to prevent the kind of systematic failures that have been reported in recent months. The Secretary, while open to the idea of improvement, remained defensive of her department's record and resistant to any reforms that would limit her executive discretion. The session concluded with a sense of unresolved tension, as both sides remained firmly entrenched in their respective positions. The expansion of executive authority within the Department of Homeland Security has fostered a climate where administrative rulemaking often replaces legislative intent. This shift represents a significant challenge to the traditional understanding of the separation of powers, as the agency increasingly operates with a degree of autonomy that borders on the unaccountable. Representative Slotkin argued that when an agency can redefine its own jurisdiction and enforcement priorities without congressional approval, the democratic process is effectively sidelined. The Secretary's reliance on executive orders to bypass legislative gridlock was framed by critics as a convenient but dangerous shortcut that undermines the stability of the law. This tension highlights a growing crisis in American governance, where the executive branch is expected to solve complex social issues through unilateral action rather than through the messy process of compromise. The investigation further explored the department's use of advanced surveillance technologies and their potential for infringing upon the privacy rights of American citizens and legal residents. Slotkin raised pointed questions about the lack of transparent guidelines governing the collection and storage of biometric data by federal agents during enforcement operations. There is a profound concern that these technological tools, originally designed for counterterrorism, are being repurposed for domestic immigration enforcement without adequate judicial oversight. The Secretary defended the use of these technologies as vital force multipliers in an era of limited manpower and evolving threats to national security. However, the absence of a clear legal framework for these activities creates a surveillance creep that threatens the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. The rhetoric used by department leadership was also scrutinized for its potential to incite a culture of hostility within the ranks of federal law enforcement. Slotkin pointed to internal communications that appeared to encourage agents to prioritize speed and volume over the careful assessment of individual legal claims. When the language of warfare and invasions is used to describe civilian migration, it inevitably alters the way agents interact with the populations they are tasked with managing. This shift in tone can lead to a dehumanization of subjects, making it easier for constitutional violations to occur and go unreported within the chain of command. The Secretary was challenged to explain how she maintains professional standards and ethical conduct in an environment that increasingly rewards aggressive enforcement at the expense of procedural fairness. The discussion then moved to the long-term impact of these policies on the integrity of the American education system, specifically regarding the recruitment of international talent. Many of the students targeted in recent enforcement actions are enrolled in high-tech and scientific programs that are critical to the nation's future economic competitiveness. Slotkin argued that by creating an unwelcoming or hostile environment for these scholars, the department is inadvertently aiding global competitors who are eager to attract such talent. The Secretary's focus on immediate security concerns appeared to overlook the brain drain that could result from a reputation for arbitrary and unpredictable immigration enforcement. This segment of the hearing illustrated the complex ways in which Homeland security policy intersects with national economic strategy and global soft power. Furthermore, the inquiry addressed the systemic lack of transparency regarding the department's collaboration with private data brokers to track the movement of individuals within the country. This practice allows the government to circumvent traditional warrant requirements by purchasing information that would otherwise be protected by privacy laws. Slotkin contended that this commercial loophole represents a fundamental threat to the privacy of every person in the United States, not just those targeted for immigration enforcement. The Secretary's refusal to provide specific details on these contracts only heightened the sense of unease among civil liberties advocates on the committee. This reliance on the private sector to conduct state surveillance functions creates a layer of opacity that makes traditional congressional oversight nearly impossible to achieve. The role of political appointees in shaping the operational priorities of the department was also a major point of contention during the testimony. Slotkin raised concerns that career professionals within the agency are being sidelined in favor of ideologically driven individuals who prioritize political loyalty over institutional expertise. This politicization of the federal bureaucracy can lead to the suppression of dissenting views and the manipulation of data to support predetermined political outcomes. The Secretary defended her right to appoint individuals who share the administration's vision, but the lawmaker argued that this approach risks turning the department into a political tool. The hearing sought to uncover whether policy decisions were based on objective security assessments or on the perceived political needs of the administration. The impact of these policies on the mental health and social cohesion of affected communities was another critical area of investigation. Slotkin presented evidence that the constant threat of enforcement actions, even against those with legal status, has led to a widespread decline in community trust in law enforcement. When people are afraid to contact the police or seek medical assistance for fear of being caught in a federal dragnet, the overall safety of the community is diminished. The Secretary maintained that her department's mission is to enforce the law, not to manage social perceptions, but critics argue that these two goals are inextricably linked. The discussion emphasized that true security cannot be achieved in a climate of pervasive fear and social fragmentation. The inquiry also touched on the department's role in managing the nation's response to domestic extremism and how it balances this with its immigration priorities. Slotkin argued that by overallocating resources to immigration enforcement, the department has neglected the growing threat of internal radicalization and domestic terrorism. This imbalance suggests a strategic misalignment where political optics drive resource allocation more than actual risk assessments. The Secretary's defense of the department's budget allocations centered on the need to address the crisis at the border as the most pressing threat to national sovereignty. This disagreement reflects a fundamental dispute over where the greatest dangers to the American homeland truly lie. As the session progressed, the focus turned toward the necessity of legislative reforms that would restrict the department's ability to operate without specific congressional authorization. Slotkin proposed several measures aimed at increasing the reporting requirements for enforcement actions and limiting the use of expedited removal for certain vulnerable populations. She argued that the era of trust us governance must end and be replaced by a system of rigorous, statutory checks and balances. The Secretary remained resistant to these proposals, claiming that they would hamper her agency's ability to respond to rapidly changing security situations. This part of the exchange highlighted the deep-seated resistance within the executive branch to any external constraints on its power. The final segments of this part of the hearing focused on the ethical responsibilities of those who serve in high-level government positions. Slotkin reminded the Secretary that her oath of office is to the Constitution, not to any individual politician or political party. The lawmakers' closing questions were a demand for a renewed commitment to the principles of transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. The Secretary's responses, while professionally delivered, left many of the committee's concerns unaddressed, pointing toward a continued period of legal and political conflict. The hearing concluded with a clear sense that the battle over the soul of the Department of Homeland Security is far from over. The concluding phase of this historic inquiry brought into sharp focus the enduring struggle between the necessity of state power and the preservation of individual liberty. Representative Slotkin's rigorous cross-examination served as a catalyst for a broader national conversation regarding the ethical boundaries of national security enforcement. It became increasingly clear that the disputes observed in the hearing room were not merely about administrative protocols but about the very identity of the United States as a beacon of due process. The testimony underscored a critical inflection point where the federal government must decide if it will remain anchored in constitutional traditions or drift toward a model of executive exceptionalism. This choice will undoubtedly shape the legal landscape for generations, determining the extent to which the state can intrude upon the lives of those within its borders. The debate over the rule of law versus political optics reached its rhetorical peak as the committee analyzed the long-term erosion of public institutional trust. When government agencies prioritize the creation of a political narrative over the consistent application of justice, the foundational pillars of democracy begin to weaken. Slotkin argued that the Department of Homeland Security's current trajectory risks alienating the very citizenry it is sworn to protect, creating a vacuum where suspicion replaces civic cooperation. The Secretary's defense, while centered on the pragmatic challenges of border security, failed to address the qualitative damage inflicted on the nation's social contract. A security apparatus that operates without the broad consent and confidence of the governed is inherently fragile and prone to systemic failure. As we look toward the future, the integration of cybersecurity into the core of national defense appears more urgent than ever, yet remains entangled in budgetary politics. The hearing demonstrated that a nation's strength in the digital age is measured not by the height of its walls, but by the resilience of its networks and the transparency of its algorithms. Slotkin's insistence on restoring funding to state-level cyber programs reflects a strategic vision that recognizes the decentralized nature of modern conflict. If the federal government continues to neglect these digital frontiers, it invites a new era of vulnerability that no amount of physical enforcement can mitigate. The shift toward a holistic security posture requires a fundamental reassessment of how the Department of Homeland Security allocates its vast resources. The protection of the writ of habeas corpus and the sanctity of due process must be reaffirmed as non-negotiable elements of American jurisprudence. The hearing exposed the dangerous precedent that is set when the executive branch is allowed to interpret constitutional protections as mere obstacles to be bypassed. Slotkin's call for legislative reform is a necessary step toward re-establishing the role of Congress as a vigorous overseer of federal law enforcement. Without such intervention, the balance of power will continue to tilt toward a centralized authority that is increasingly insulated from judicial review and public accountability. The integrity of the American legal system depends on the courage of lawmakers to challenge the state when it oversteps its rightful boundaries. Ultimately, this confrontation stands as a testament to the vital importance of government accountability and the relentless pursuit of transparency. The lessons learned from this inquiry extend far beyond the specific policies of any single administration, touching upon the universal challenge of governing a free society. It reminds us that the rule of law is not a self-sustaining entity but a living framework that requires constant vigilance and protection. By choosing to prioritize the principles of fairness and equity over the allure of political theater, the nation can begin to heal the divisions that have characterized recent years. The path forward demands a commitment to a government that is both powerful enough to protect its people and humble enough to respect their rights.